All right. That doesn't sound very great. It sounds like you're sleepy. You can't be sleepy, okay? Unacceptable. You had an hour to eat, another half hour to run around and get your juices back flowing again. So, all right. So we have Dr. Michael Shively and Dr. I'm going to get Mr. Hanna here. I swear I want to get his first name, Michael Hanna. So I can't call them Michael. They won't know who I'm talking about. Here to talk about pornography addiction and online exploitation. And what I'd like to do is get them both up here at the same time, if I may. I'd like to introduce them both, and then I'm going to ask that Dr. Shively start first his presentation, and then he's followed by Dr. Hanna. So I hope that's not too weird for either of them. So let me introduce Dr. Shively first, who's walking up first here to my right. Dr. Shively is dedicated to supporting those working to prevent and respond to exploitation and abuse. Through his 30-year career in applied research, he has provided practitioners, legislators, agency managers, and advocates with information and tools used to advance their efforts to address human trafficking, sexual violence, and other forms of victimization. Between 2003 and his joining NCOSI in 2020, Dr. Shively received a continuous series of federal awards to lead research on the perpetration, same difference, of human trafficking and sexual exploitation, victimization, and system responses to both survivors and offenders. He's been at the forefront of efforts to prevent sex trafficking and exploitation by attacking their root cause, consumer demand for commercial sex. He directed a rigorous evaluation model program designed to deter sex buyers and founded Demand Forum, a website documented prevention tactics used in over 2,100 communities throughout the U.S. Dr. Shively's prior research also includes developing a method for producing valid estimates of human trafficking prevalence, for identifying opportunities for early identification, and support for survivors. In other studies, he examined the traits and motivations of convicted human traffickers and the origins and structure of the criminal enterprises, and conducted a national survey about police experiences responding to local human trafficking. His work to apply research to policy and evidence-based practice includes presenting at training programs and expert work groups convened by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Department of State, U.S. Department of Health and Social Services, U.S. Department of Justice, National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine, Center for Disease Control and Prevention. I'm glad he's here in California, as a matter of fact, for that. International Association of Chiefs of Police, National Association of Attorneys General, and the Massachusetts Bar Association. He also served on the Massachusetts Attorney General's Human Trafficking Task Force and the Regional Human Trafficking Work Group at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Please welcome Dr. Shively. And we're going to go a little bit more hometown with Dr. Michael Hanna, who's Associate Professor of Psychology and Neurobiology here at Vanguard University. Dr. Hanna received his doctorate degree in biological sciences with a specialization in neurobiology and behavior from the University of California, Irvine. Go Anteaters. Dr. Hanna's interest in drug addiction developed when he joined a research lab as an undergraduate that studies the neurobiology behind cue-elicited drug craving behavior. Prior to Vanguard, Dr. Hanna taught the neurobiology lab at UCI and was an adjunct faculty at Mount St. Antonio Community College and Los Angeles Trade Technical College. Areas of his interest include substance abuse, neurological disorders, and developmental disorders. Apart from Vanguard, Dr. Hanna is involved in services aimed at providing food and clothing to the homeless in downtown LA. He is also involved in tutoring and college preparation for high school youth in Orange County. Please welcome Dr. Hanna. So to start our presentation, I'm going to ask for Dr. Shively to begin.
Well, that introduction was deeply embarrassing. I don't think anyone expected them to read the whole thing. I thought it was just background. So it sounds a lot better than it felt when I was doing all that stuff. I guess we want to distinguish us. The doctor is the same and the Michael's the same. I'm not a real doctor. This is a real doctor. I have a doctorate that just means you don't know how to stop going to college. If someone's choking, don't look at me. Um, anyone expecting Dawn Hawkins to be speaking is probably deeply disappointed. She had planned for over a year on being here and fully intended to, and she just absolutely couldn't at the last minute. So she probably thought, I need to find a middle-aged white guy to talk about this issue. People love that. So here I am. We will make the best of it. No, I'm really appreciative of being here and having a place to talk about this. So before moving on from Dawn a little bit, you know, I don't know how many of you know her, but I met her once, and she talked me out of a 30-year research career into joining her at the National Center. So yeah, she's a force of nature, and do the best we can here. So you know, this is her title, and some of these slides are hers. I can't fake being her and speaking the way she would speak about things, but you know, I think the core message will be the same, which is that I don't know what you want. You know, we're debating within the National Center on Sexual Exploitation. You know, whether we should stop using the term pornography and start calling it obscenity. In the legal world, obscenity has some certain advantages, and it doesn't have some of the connotations that make it a little bit harder to suppress or get rid of. So, you know, that's part of the reason I'm sort of, you know, stumbling over it. But basic idea is that obscenity or pornography, whatever you want to call it, very few people really have thought this is a great idea, that it's actually good for anyone. There isn't any religion on the planet that actually thinks that it's a pro-social sort of thing that is helpful and brings us closer together and makes us happier and any of those things. But here it is, and it's just gotten stronger and stronger and more ubiquitous over time. So what is going on here? And I'm going to mostly talk about, I think you're going to cover like the effects, what it actually does to people that are exposed to it. And we're not really talking anymore about having seen nudity, having seen an old Playboy magazine. That used to be kind of the mode. That used to be the sort of thing that we would be arguing about and talking about. And it's just not that world anymore. So the sort of images, and not only the types, but the accessibility, the content, and the quantity of it is just a totally different animal. This couldn't be simpler, but I'm still struggling with it. Okay, so I don't think in this audience I really have to try to convince you that it's everywhere or that it's not the best thing in the world. There are just so many manifestations. Now, the thing as a researcher that I always am checking in with myself about is I don't want to make the mistake that I see other people make when they seem to only see things one way and maybe not understand everything fully, which is just looking for the stuff I want. And it's pretty easy to make the case you want for anything by just cherry picking the sort of facts, the sort of anecdotes, the sort of stories that just resonate with you or seem to illustrate how you think about things. So, with pornography, we can easily see in the media that, you know, there is a sex offender that's abusing children, and lo and behold, they find a closet full or a hard disk full of pornography, right? So there you go. As a researcher, I'm thinking, is that a chicken or egg problem, right? You know, we've all had to think about that. Is it a cause of dysfunction, or is it the dysfunction that makes a person capable of abusing children that also leads them to looking for this stuff? So I feel comfortable, you know, talking about anecdotes now because the empirical evidence, the science behind it, is just getting so clear so fast. And I really hope you're not going to contradict all this when you come up next. You know, you know, you just hear it over and over on schools. You know, this is something schools are having to think about. You know, it used to be fairly easy to catch someone that slipped a naughty magazine onto a campus, and the content can be offensive, but it just only goes so far. But now, like, every kid with a phone has access to all kinds of things just instantly. So it's really, you know, the control over it is completely gone, you know, or it's the challenge in controlling access is really different. But you know, there's so many websites now. Pornhub is one of the targets of the National Center. It's you know, literally gets billions of views in a year. I mean, tens of billions. It's I've heard estimates saying that the most transacted electronic thing on Earth is pornography. So, you know, the market is strong, the demand for it is strong, and we're really trying to catch up to the fact that it is so much more accessible now, and what does that do to people? So, I just want to give you some perspective, and part of it's like a personal sort of journey to coming back to thinking about this as a researcher, and my experience thinking about it, I think, tracks really well with the timeline that we're talking about and how the world has changed around it. So I'm old. I'm you know, old. So when I was in school and thinking about projects, and then when I was in a master's program and was thinking about the things that I'm interested in, I ended up doing my master's thesis, which I got done in 1986. And it was on the relationship between pornography and sexual aggression. And it was on campus, males and females and relationships. And those of us who remember the 80s and the 70s as adults remember things like the movement to try to get date rape taken seriously, you know, and thinking about marital rape as real rape. Now you know, now the world's changed. That movement was incredibly successful, changing how everything works, how systems operate. You know, there isn't a college campus that doesn't have a rape crisis center. There isn't a college campus where the men are told no means no and all that. Well, that was a result of a lot of hard work. And in the early stages, there were so many things that we take for granted as fact now that were still in question. You know, how common is it? How big of a problem is it? Is it really that harmful if it's a boyfriend or husband? Again, it's kind of laughably obvious and a stupid question now, but it wasn't back then to a lot of people. So, you know, it's there's some lessons to be learned from that. So, in the 70s and through the 90s, I think you can really create a timeline. You can chop it up any way you feel like, but you know, there's two different distinct eras, and one is 70s, you can take it earlier if you wanted to. Through the 90s, the technology was pretty simple. You were either talking about videotapes or film, and maybe if you know, late 90s, maybe a few DVD players here and there, but it was really, you know, stuff you had to buy, carry. It wasn't cheap. It wasn't that easy to get a hold of. You either had to mail order it or go into a shop that sold it, and it was pretty expensive, you know, especially if you think about now, like the volume of material now that is free and instantly obtainable of any variety presents a lot of challenges. But back then, it's like, you know, a kid with a newspaper route would have to save enough to buy a black market Playboy magazine or something, you know, and how many of those can you buy? How many can you hide? You know, it's just, if you think about that technology of paper, you would have to walk into a store to buy it. A little kid couldn't, so maybe they had an older brother or their father had one or something. So there were barriers to access that were really practical, and they really limited what people could get and could see. The content was just so much different. It was basically nudity, maybe intercourse, you know, if you got the really extreme stuff back then. The evidence of the impact, now this is, okay, in the 80s, I was trying to study it, and of course I had to do a literature review. And, you know, those who were into looking at that literature, there's Malamud and Donnerstein and all these, you know, things like rape myth acceptance and exposure to pornography. And to be honest, I just didn't think it was convincing. So, you kind of know in your bones, and sooner or later you think it's probably going to be provable. I spent 10 years diving into that literature, and I just couldn't, I don't think the case was there. The chicken and egg problem. Are you seeing a manifestation of people, it's a spurious correlation, it's the traits that make you want that certain things and then act a certain way. And was pornography really the thing that caused that? So I wasn't convinced. 10 years ago, I wrote a paper on human trafficking and what we can do about it, and dealing with demand and the buyers and the men, the consumers of pornography. A lot of times are the consumers of commercial sex and trafficking victims. 10 years ago, I wrote a paper and I said, we all understand that it can't be a good thing. At best, it's just not a driver, but strategically, it doesn't make sense to target pornography, because you're going to waste so much time getting drug into the tar pit of talking about, First Amendment and freedom and erotica versus pornography, and then you get the common sense problem. All these legislators say, look, I saw that stuff when I was a kid and I didn't hurt anyone. And so, you're fighting so much, and you don't have that smoking gun evidentiary link that's going to change minds unless someone's predisposed to believe you anyway. So 10 years ago, I was saying, you guys, including the place I am now working at, the National Center on Sexual Exploitation, I said, keep at it, good, that's fine. That's not what I think is going to be productive. I've changed my mind. Things have changed a lot. So if we look now and think about, roughly the 2000s to the present, the technology, again, you're hearing it over and over, I won't belabor that point, but the distribution is just absolutely everywhere. And, the thing that says, are you 18? Click on yes and you get anything you want. I mean, seriously? The content, it's so easy to distribute, and the content, there's a market for everything, and there absolutely is a market. And not only that, when we talk about markets, we seem to be talking, it's money, we usually mean money, but there is an immense market that is really just transacting things for free. It's just exchanging, and no one's really getting money. People are, the video equipment's so good and cheap and easy and everyone's got it. They just film whatever they want and then they post it because that's what they want. Because if you put something on some websites, then you get access to other things. So it's just, it's an absolutely different world. And the evidence, again, I'm going to leave it up to real Dr. Mike, but it is really an avalanche, and I'm absolutely convinced. I'm a skeptic who is 100% buying it, and the types of negative impacts and the study designs now are catching up, and you really can say there is a causal link. This happened before that happened, and it's really not, I don't think, an open question for anyone that wants to be fair and actually think about this. So. Right? Thank you. Yeah. So, what can be done about it? That's obviously what, we want to spend a lot of time talking about it. Well, one of the things the National Center, and again, some of it's going to look like an infomercial. I'm not trying to sell anyone on the center. It's just that, this is what we're doing, and that's what we can talk, I can talk about. But a lot of people in this room and elsewhere are also fighting these same battles. Part of it is just getting it framed in people's mind in a certain way. So, one of the discussions we're having, should we call it a hazard or a threat or a crisis? Oh, we get hammered by calling it a crisis. A crisis implies rapid growth. Is this rapid growth? It's everywhere, but is it rapidly growing? Oh Lord, you just, it's the tar pit thing again. Let's drag you into the discussion, kill the clock, there's your 10 minutes on CNN, and you haven't been able to say anything you want because we're defining everything. So, but behind the scenes on an ongoing basis, let's just call this what it is, and it's a hazard. And there is a legislative effort that where am I supposed to point this anyway? Obviously, half the time it works. There we go. So one of the things the National Center has is a law center. They're building a research capacity. That's why they hired me, to get researchers on board. They have a bunch of attorneys. They got a bunch of activists. And one of the things that we're working on is state legislation and declarations. You know, just say it. You know, pass a resolution saying that this is the official position of the state government of state X, is that this is a problem. You know, it's not, we believe it's not benign. We believe it is actually a health problem. So, you know, 15 states have passed resolutions, and we're working on more. Another thing is to go after businesses that facilitate this stuff. So this is a very, you know, there are legitimate types of pushback against anything you can call censorship. I am the staunch believer in speech and free speech, and don't think censorship is the answer to most things. But there also are limits, and if you can prove that saying certain things is absolutely harmful, then you can't say them. And if certain types of media, images, content actually can be linked to direct harm, then harm is something that can be limited. So going after the facilitators, and they push back, and there are some good reasons for doing it, but mostly it's they don't want to slow down profit, right? So any search engine, any sort of electronic, you know, media, they almost reflexively, almost always, when you say, look, you gotta really control this. It's way too easy to get ads for things that are obviously selling someone for sex, selling a child for sex, or being a portal to child pornography. It's just way too easy. I mean, what are you doing to stop it? And they fight it. But there have been a lot of wins, you know, and the thing is, it isn't the government passing a law say you cannot do that. What it is just basically shaming them into volunteering to do it, you know, just putting pressure on them. You know, one of the things National Center does have this Dirty Dozen list, you know, where you know, we just target, it can be people, but usually it's a corporation. It can be a government, you know, it could be a nation's government. If it's clear that they're, you know, Nevada, the state of Nevada was on the Dirty Dozen list at one point. So, you know, it's any sort of entity that is clearly making the lives easier of sex traffickers and child abusers. That's going to end up on the target list. So I'm gonna, you know, I really don't want to take. I don't know how much time I have left. Like, okay, a few minutes. So basically, we're trying to put pressure on it. We've had victories in the hotel industry, trying to get, you know, to at least have parental restrictions, but at most just not to sell things online. Part of the reason they're kind of saying yes to that is they're not making as much money anymore because everyone's got their own. You know, why spend $15 in the hotel when your laptop's got, you know, gigabytes of it? So, but also, you know, I mean, it's still nice not to have it there. So, I'm going to skip some of these things, but, you know, we've been persuaded the military to stop selling porn on base and to start, you know, putting filters on their internet capacity. And I want to talk about something where I'm going to talk at another session. A lot of people probably are dealing with this issue of demand, and you know that as a market, it is demand driven. And the thing about it is you know, us pinheads would call it recursive or something that just makes you say, what does that mean? But you know, there's feedback. You know, it's a cause and an effect. You know, I mean, pornography exists because there's a market for it. And it shapes the market, and it shapes the hearts and minds of the people that see a lot of it. And it's the nature of it. It tends to walk people out into the extremes and into things like being compulsive or addicted. I'm going to talk about just one guy, and you know, as a researcher, I kind of resist anecdotes. But one of the projects that I did for the Department of Justice, I did a couple on demand. I did on victim identification and prevalence estimation for sex trafficking. And one of the projects we had was looking at the traffickers themselves. So we actually had the data from all 2,500 people that have ever been convicted for a federal human trafficking crime. Then we pulled 500 of their case records. It has all the words, you know, and all the stuff, the police reports and the testimony. And we pulled content out of there. Then we pulled a sample of convicted sex offenders, and we actually went to federal prisons and interviewed them. And I interviewed, well, one little fact, this is a little bit of a side thing, but One of the things I asked 20 of the convicted sex traffickers was, would that have been easier to do or harder to do if prostitution were decriminalized? And the typical response started with either laughter or a frown or some variation of, "Are you kidding me? That is a stupid question." 100% of them said, absolutely, of course, it would be so much easier to track the people if prostitution were illegalized. So, you know, those of us who are kind of trying to push back against the decriminalization movement, you know, one line you can give them is, you know, do you think you're on the right side of this issue if the policy that you're advocating is the dream policy of convicted sex traffickers? You know, so anyway, one of these guys that I talked to was, it was probably the one interview that just took the most out of me. I just wanted to cry, take a nap, throw up, take a shower. I mean, it was a tough one. But this guy, here's the guy's story. When I interviewed him, he was in his late 50s. He'd been in prison around about 5 years or so. And the thing is, like, you know, they can tell you all kinds of stuff. Sometimes they're really, you know, not very truthful people, believe it or not. But we had the story before we went in. Like, we knew exactly. And some of them were absolutely dead on honest about everything. You know, they just, some of them we caught, you know, and, you know, so that it was nice to have that. Well, this guy, like, I am convinced he was telling the truth from top to bottom, because I went back and I did more research and everything checked out. This guy was a perfectly fine person as far as anyone can tell. He had 5 children, he was raised in the Catholic Church, and he raised his family in the Catholic Church, and it was just life. I mean, it really wasn't, you know, they didn't try to be religious, they just were, right? And they were a family of faith. And there is absolutely no indication that this guy was any problem to anyone until his children were adults. And very successful construction business, wealthy, generous, donated, all that. And he said that he kind of had things in the back of his mind, like, you know, thinking about children, but it just absolutely never went back to anything, you know, like he never went in porn or anything. He took a business trip to Asia, and in the culture of some of the countries, a typical end to a business evening is to go to a brothel and buy sex. So the hosts that he was with, that's what you do eat, karaoke, and brothel. And he discovered that he had certain appetites that he was unaware of before. And he liked children. And what he did was he satisfied those appetites that he just found out when he was over there. When he went back to America, what did he do? The closest thing he could get to it was porn. So he started finding out the world of child porn. And it stoked his fire. He took every chance he could to go back to Asia. Then it got worse. What he did, and this is what got him caught, what he did was he had children as young as like 5 and 8. He would have sex with them, and he would write things on their bodies that were derogatory, horrible. I don't even want to say what they were, but just the worst thing you can imagine, you know, really. And he filmed it, and he filmed himself, and then he was in this culture where they were transacting it. Pornography really aided him in getting worse. And it also gave him an outlet, and he had an appetite for child porn that he'd never had his whole life until he got exposed to it. And then he became a horrible criminal. When I saw him, he wrote a letter. He gave me a letter to take with me that he wrote, and it was basically to the world. And he told me, he said, I'm going to be eligible for parole in 25 years. And he goes, I don't want it. He said, I'm a monster. I don't want to get out. I know what I did was bad. I can't believe it was me, but I did it. And I know, no matter what I say and no matter what anyone tries to tell me, that I'll do it again. If I get out, I'm going to just do it again. It's an absolute compulsion. And he said, I'm where I belong. I belong in prison the rest of my life, and said, I can never apologize enough and all that. So I'm not trying to get you to feel empathy for him or to feel sorry for him or justify. I'm just saying that you know, it's easy to tell people what you're doing is wrong, and a lot of people don't know it, and it's good. But some people, like, they know that. I mean, it's no news to them. There isn't any cultural support for having sex with children and filming it and all that. I mean, it's a broken machine. You know, the guy's just wrong, right? But pornography was like a facilitator, you know, and it really gave him an outlet, and it gave him motivation to do much, much more of this than he otherwise would have. So anyway, that's just, you know, like a story, but, you know, boy, the research is bearing out that it is, you know, it has a capacity to do all kinds of things, including taking someone and really helping them become monsters. And now that's an outlier. You know, the typical person isn't going to go there, but as you're going to find out, you know, they go other places that aren't good. So thank you.
All right, thank you guys for having me. So let's see if I do have better luck. There you go. There you go. Down. Okay. So what I'm going to try to talk about is pornography a harmless compulsion? Some even might actually say it's beneficial. When I was actually at UCI, I had a group that came there and actually was promoting pornography. And the idea, right, was that if you have access to pornography, right, there is at least an outlet for your urges, and so that way you don't have to go ahead and perform it on people. And so there's that big push, and I've actually heard it several times. So my question, right, that hopefully I'll answer, is it harmless? And a lot of times I get the question, does porn change the brain? And actually that's a wrong question, because everything changes the brain, right? If you play a musical instrument, it changes your brain, right? So the question isn't, does it change your brain? The question is, right, does it negatively change the brain in the same characteristics, for example, as a drug addict? Right? Are there similar changes, right, in the pathways, in the anatomy of the brain? Does it predispose the brain to other addictions, other mental health issues? And so those are the things that I'm kind of going to hopefully address. So I'll share with you just a few studies. So this one study using fMRI, which tracks just blood flow, tracks volume of the brain, they found that there was actually identical changes to the frontal lobe as those found in cocaine and meth addicts. And a lot of times, I actually just got this question today. Someone was asking me, if you put someone in a brain scan, I told them I can definitely tell if they're an addict or not. But I won't actually be able to tell you whether they're a drug addict or if it's a behavioral addiction, because it actually acts on the exact same pathways on the brain. I wouldn't be able to tell you if it's a porn addict or a meth addict. That's how much it changes. They found that there was a decrease in the volume, particularly in the frontal lobes, and then this particular area called the superior frontal region. And we know especially that the frontal lobe is the most important part of our brain as far as that truly makes us human, distinguishes us from, for example, animals. In another study, they found that pseudosexual interest and sexual recidivism were correlated with reduced gray matter, particularly in something called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is right around here, and another structure called the insular cortex. And to me, that caught my attention right away, because those two areas, the dorsal prefrontal cortex, is especially related to empathy and metacognition. And the insular cortex is associated with actually being able to feel other people's pain. And so, to me, it's no surprise when a lot of times you interview people that are addicted to pornography, they don't have that sense of feeling, empathizing with other people. Here's a couple of stats that they've seen. Let me just pull University of New Hampshire did a study where they showed that states with the highest readership of pornographic magazines like Playboy also had the highest rates of rape. The Michigan State Police Department found that pornography was used or imitated in 41% of their sex crimes that they investigated. Dr. Victor Klein did research that showed how men who become addicted to pornographic material begin to want more explicit or deviant material and end up acting out the way that they've seen. And actually, based on that last story, you can actually already see a lot of similarities between drug addicts and pornography. Drug addicts will tell you, I know what I'm doing is bad. I know that it's harming me. I know that it's harming others. But they continue doing it anyways. Same thing like the last story. He knows it's bad, right? But still continues to do it. Here's an interesting quote by Ted Bundy the day before he was executed in Florida. But I've lived in prison for a long time now, and I've met a lot of men who were motivated to commit violence like me. And without exception, every one of them was deeply involved in pornography. Without exception, deeply influenced and consumed by an addiction of pornography. Here's another study. This one made a correlation between the hours of pornographic consumption and gray matter volume in the right striatum and caudate nucleus. And to me, this sticks out because those two areas are two areas that are especially involved in addiction. And I'm specifically talking about drug addiction. The authors suggested that this lower volume may reflect tolerance brought about by desensitization. This is in line with the hypothesis that intense exposure to pornographic stimuli results in downregulation of the natural neutral response to sexual stimuli. And this is also very similar to drug addiction, where you start off with a little bit of drugs and you need more and more and more of the drug to end up getting that same feeling. Well, they've seen the same thing ends up happening with pornography, right? You start off with, soft porn, and then soon after that doesn't do it enough for you, and so you have to go into harder and harder porn, and that's pretty much because your brain adjusts in the exact same way that your brain adjusts to drugs, right? Your brain does that same thing to drug addiction. Porn addiction. They also found that more years and hours per week of use correlated with lower left putamen activity in response to brief sexual images. So again, now you no longer have that ability that normal things can go ahead and stimulate a person. Dysfunction of this circuitry is linked to inappropriate behavior choice, regardless of the potential negative outcomes. Very similar to drug addiction. You know that it's going to have all this negative effects on you, but you continue to do it anyways. There are clear differences in brain activities between patients who have compulsive sexual behavior and healthy volunteers. These differences mirror those of drug addicts. I think ours is a study that can help people understand that this is a real pathology. This is a real disorder, so people will not dismiss compulsive sexual behavior as something moralistic or even something beneficial that helps people not perform it out. This is not different from how pathological gambling and substance addiction were viewed several years ago. Now, when I was researching this, because my main research interest is actually in drug addictions, but something that automatically popped up to me that I found very interesting is there's this gene called delta phos-B. And what this gene does is every time you do a behavior over and over and over, the levels of this gene increase incrementally, slowly. And what eventually happens is when you end up having a lot of this gene pretty much causes changes in your brain that morph neurons and desensitize you to certain things, and it sensitizes you to certain cues. So now the smallest thing can go ahead and trigger that response that you want to go ahead and perform this behavior. And what was interesting with this delta FOSB, it was always associated with drug addiction. And then a recent study found that this delta FOSB is also overexpressed in those who view pornography. And so what this guy does is it's in this part of the brain called the nucleus accumbens. You Google nucleus accumbens, it's the #1 structure that's associated with drug addiction. And they found it, again, in people with pornography. Go to the next. And so what this guy does is it suppresses a neurotransmitter in your brain called dynorphin. And this is very similar to endorphins, which make you feel better. And so what it does is it alters the neuroplasticity in your brain so that your brain starts suppressing that release of endorphins. And so now your brain actually doesn't feel normal unless you have it. And then, sorry if you can actually go back, continue it. It reduces the sensitivity of the reward pathway. And this is very, you'll hear this a lot with people who are porn addicts. They will say things that normally should go ahead and stimulate me. Now that I have been watching hardcore porn, that no longer does it. So they now have unrealistic expectations, and that's part of this delta FOSB because it alters those neurons. And that's why it's not uncommon to hear stories like this. Let me go here. We eventually got married and things seemed so good for the first 6 months of our marriage. But it wasn't long until I started sensing a difference in him. He was still very good to me, but he didn't seem as into me. The only thing that seemed weird to me was that he didn't want to have sex with me at least 70% of the time it was brought up. I felt so rejected every time, but told myself maybe I was just too sexual or forceful about it. This year he finally told me that he hadn't felt attracted to me since about 6 months into our marriage. And that he still loves me, he just didn't find me attractive. I've come to understand that this has absolutely nothing to do with me and everything to do with the unrealistic expectations that pornography created for this person so long ago. Today my husband hasn't actively viewed porn for 9 years and it is still a third party in our marriage. Very similar to addiction. Once it changes the brain, it's permanent, at least relatively permanent. The interesting study also that I've come across is before pornography used to be mostly associated with men. But the numbers are actually now rising, where more women are actually getting involved. And I'll share this last quote with you. I know men have issues with erectile dysfunction because of porn. They can't get an erection because porn has distorted their ability to become aroused. Well, it turns out it's the same for women. Nothing my husband can do, is willing to do, can arouse me. And it's not like he's only willing to try a handful of mundane things. Yes, a woman's inability to become aroused doesn't prevent sex from happening like a man's inability, but my lack of arousal means an experience which should be beautiful and pleasurable is miserable and incredibly painful. I still have a sexual appetite. I'm still sexually attracted to my husband. But I'm not sexually aroused, and it's not because he's some ugly potato. Good to know. It's because of the lingering effects of my addiction. Again, notice that lingering effect. It's still there. I deny him something that is an important part of our marriage, and my own sexual appetite is perpetually frustrated. I'm continuously unsatisfied because of my own stupid action years ago. And so I like ending with these quotes because sometimes we can kind of dehumanize it when you're just talking about the brain, but we have to forget that, or remember that this affects people, married people, because of this unrealistic expectations, all the things that it does to the brain. So, thank you guys.
Thank you. Please, if you have questions for either speaker, would you put them on Slido? If I can find where I hid the Slido, even better. There we go. So, Dr. Hannon, real quick, how much exposure to porn has to occur to cause changes in the brain?
Actually, I don't know. Say that it actually is very similar with drug addiction. Very similar. That makes Go ahead. Same thing with the drug addiction. You can have one person who takes one shot of something, another person takes 20 shots. It takes this person 20 shots to finally get addicted, or this person takes one shot, they become addicted, and see changes in the brain. So it's based on the complexity of the brain. It's almost, you can never generalize a lot when it comes to the brain. So it's hard to actually give a set number. It just depends.
Depends on the individual and what they're tolerant for and stuff like that. Okay. Dr. Shively, is there a resource worksheet that can be shared with parents or teens about how viewing pornography can affect the brain, or can, affect families, things like that?
Yeah. Is this working? Yeah. I know there are other. I've seen them. I've seen groups, organizations that put things together. I know that the National Center. It's Lisa Thompson and Don Hawkins. We're working on that right now, and there have been sort of like what to look for in your children, how to talk to them about it, how to spot trouble. Like it's hard to get a kid to admit to something or to spot it, and there's a lot of different things. It's advice for parents, and then for parents to how to spot things in their kids. And what we're doing at the moment is kind of backing up from that and trying to put a research foundation under all of it, so that anything we can say is like, these are the sort of problems that your children could be presented with, and this is how easy it is for them to be exposed to it, and all of that. We're trying to basically put a foundation of science underneath every bit that we can to make it, just that much more convincing, and then try to get some of these tools to be sort of hardwired into school districts and daycare worlds and things like that.
Thank you. And then a follow-up, it's bouncing around here, so I'm trying to keep track of this. How would you, Dr. Shively, how would you provide support for a CSEC youth who continues to watch porn? Or would that be?
See, this is where you need Dawn. She would have this on my fingertips. So that is that just about like a trafficking victim? Is that specifically trafficking?
Yeah, commercial sexual exploitation of children.
So could you read the question again to me?
It died. So basically, how would you provide support for a CSEC victim, person who's been victimized as a child, human trafficking victim, sex trafficking victim, who's been exposed to porn?
There's the two things. There's the sexual exploitation or trafficking victimization. That's one element, and it presents different types of trauma, and different types of responses are needed because that's its own thing. There are special things that happen to a person if depending on the type of victimization. Then there's just the child sex part of it. Now the thing is there's a huge infrastructure to deal with child sexual abuse, partly because it is such a pervasive problem, but before the trafficking element got added relatively recently, I mean, there was no federal law on human trafficking until 2000, and not all of the states had their own sex trafficking law or human trafficking law until 2012, so it's relatively new. One of the things that's real clear is that residential treatment for survivors, whether they're children or adults, is just incredibly under-resourced. There are maybe 1,000 beds in the entire United States for that. But the thing is that there's so many other needs, and there's significant overlap. So any sort of service for traumatized children, traumatized women, sexual abuse victims, that there's enough overlap. So that's where I would go if I were, in a community and it was either my own child, heaven forbid, or anyone else's child, heaven forbid. That's where I would look.
Thank you. Do either of you have any numbers on the percentage of men that actually access porn or use porn, or if there's anything like that? Just the question is like, is it all men, or just like 10 or 99.9% of men, or what's the, that's the question up there right now.
I think it's nearly universal that people have been exposed to something that you would call pornography. You can have the conversation about is it art or erotica or pornography, but if you think about the definition of what makes it pornography, which is its sole purpose, there's no artistic merit, there's no this, this, and that, and it's offensive to a significant part of the community. If you look at that and then say, have people been exposed? I don't think anyone makes it out of high school or college without having seen something at some point. The other layers to the question are, how many people run into it when they don't want to, and this is a real big problem. I actually had it happen to me at work because I was doing research on human trafficking. So I did all these web searches on these keywords that were just a target for people with viruses and things. So one day I'm at my computer and I'm going to get a print job, and when I came back to my office, on the screen was the most horrendous graphic XXX horror, it was just really over the top, and that's what my screen looked like. So there were and that's me at work, and I was doing Google News searches for different things. If you're a kid that's trying to get something, I want to find like naked lady pictures, right? That's kind of quaint now compared to what's available. But say a kid, that's all they want. They just want to see some naked women because that's what they want to see. They're almost certainly going to be exposed to a lot of other things. So it's very pervasive. Most people have seen something, and it's harder to avoid than it is to actually try to get.
Thank you. There are a couple of questions about rehabs, and the theme seems to be, number one, is it, Dr. Hanna, is it a realistic option for pornography addiction? And if so, does it really stop the urges? Does it keep people from actually doing it? You know what I'm saying? Or, they still fantasize even though they're not doing it? How does that work out?
So one of the interesting things is that they have actually seen that a lot of the behavioral addictions are actually a lot more difficult to overcome than the drug addictions. And if you think about with pornography, let me relate it first to drug addiction. A lot of times people, when they go to rehab, they do amazing, right, when they are, for 4, 5, 6 months. But where is rehab? Rehab is away from where all of the cues that the brain has made that this place, these group of people are associated. So when they go back, that's why a lot of times they relapse. They go back, they say the same cues. Your brain remembers that cue, does the opposite of what the drug normally does, then they get this intense craving. Well, for the porn addict, what's their cues? Computer, phone, which is everywhere. So that's why it's really, really, really tough to overcome. One of the things that there's a couple of programs. One of them is called CovenantEyes.com, and what you do is you go ahead and you have an accountability person that actually can go ahead and see what all the websites that you're going through, so you know that you actually have someone that is going to be watching and seeing. So that's usually one of the things that they've seen to be very helpful. There's another program, I think it's called the Fortify program, which also helps, and I think this one's also free for teenagers, where it helps, has a couple programs that are that can help them. But as in those quotes, sometimes, especially if it's been going on for years, some of those, the damage in the brain is irreversible.
Okay. And you also answered a question about some of the resources available for people fighting addiction as well. There's also a question here reference to, and it has the most votes. I just want to address it myself about the changing of the terminology from having sex with children instead of raping children. I think we all can agree that it's raping children. I mean, I don't think there's any confusion about that at all with our guests or anything like that. And so we appreciate you bringing that to light. And obviously it is raping children. No one's having sex with children. No idea of consensual anything there. So understood, and we appreciate you bringing that to a point. Dr. Shively, how does porn directly play into trafficking?
I think it's involved in most different elements of it. If you start thinking about we really have not scratched the surface of, he could have done like 3 or 4 hours on all of the studies showing all the different types of negative effects. And again, these are controlled studies. You just show them stuff and then measure things. Brain imaging, brain science has just really created these tools. So now it's beyond dispute. And the other thing that you see, and this relates to the question, I'm not just going off. The forums for the men and the boys primarily, but the forums for the people themselves saying, this wrecked my life, or this is making problems for me, that's really kind of the real convincing, and they talk about so many different types of problems that they get. But anyway, so if you think about what sex trafficking is, which is a commercial sex element that is not consensual, either because someone is so young that they can't legally consent to being involved in commercial sex, or if it's forced fraud or coercion. So one of the reasons people are acquired, right, or they're recruited or taken for to be victimized or exploited is to produce pornography that can be sold. That's just one thing. It's for men, especially if you look at the brain science, you see these causal links so clearly now. Men that might otherwise have been just fine having a girlfriend or having a few casual relationships develop appetites that they really can't satisfy that way. They just have to get different races, different body types, different ages, and all of these fantasies need to be fed. And it creates a market for people that have to be able to satisfy those things. So not just in the pornography production end of it, and there's clearly a big link there, but it fuels the need to come up with people that can help satisfy the needs, the cravings, the fantasies, whatever you want to call them, that really aren't going to be done normally with the people in a community. So just say, for example, you live in a largely white community, and there are these fetishists that just need to have sex with multiple people who are Asian or whatever. They need to be gotten somehow, or at least the pornography needs to be acquired that shows those things. So it's really intertwined, just like this, the guy I'm talking about, he was convicted of human trafficking and child pornography. And it was a driver, and it also was a facilitator, and it was also a product. And that's just one guy. One guy. It was a cause, it was an effect, it was a facilitator, it was it's just kind of embedded in all of commercial sex. Pornography is just tied to all of it.
Thank you. And we're at the end of our time for this plenary. I want to thank our speakers right now, please. And Stacy Deeble Reynolds, I believe you're next. If you can come on up and gather your minions as you come, right?